Whenever there's a murder, it's the job of detectives to find out who the killer is and how they killed. And often, it's forensic evidence which provides the clues.
Each bit of information delivers that to the whole jigsaw.
I was able to test that sample and I got a DNA profile.
There's no doubt at all that forensics were absolutely crucial in this case.
In this series, we shine a light on how cutting-edge forensic techniques and the power of science were able to bring some of our most dangerous and despicable killers to justice.
This was such an unnatural crime.
It's not a question of if he will kill again, it's a question of when.
He believed that he was invincible and that nothing could stop him.
We'll hear how some of the toughest and most disturbing crimes were solved thanks to the tiniest fragments of evidence.
When you begin a forensic investigation, you don't know what you're going to find.
The officer plunged his hand into loose soil and actually felt cold flesh.
From the type of insects that were around, she'd been dead for at least 5 years.
And how even the most forensically aware of killers couldn't beat the experts and hide their crimes.
You know, if he comes out, heaven help somebody, because he is a dangerous, dangerous man.
In this episode, a simple missing person inquiry leads to an unexpected find in a freezer.
Having lifted up the lid, the first thing he sees is a human foot.
An agonising wait for families hoping it wasn't their loved one.
It was the waiting game that was horrible. It was like waiting to hear, is it her, isn't it her?
Before the most shocking discovery of all, not just one body in the freezer, but two.
One body is a dangerous person is at loose, but two, you're now talking about somebody who's on their way to essentially being a serial killer.
This is forensics, catching the killer. Every day, nearly 100 people are reported missing in London. In April 2019, police in Canning Town received a call about one more.
When somebody is reported missing in London, the officers will take a report, and it's that first stage where an assessment is made as to what kind of category that missing person sits within. Perhaps they could be somebody where it's a high risk, and the high risk can be things, people who potentially want to commit suicide, or perhaps are under threat from somebody else, or it's completely and utterly out of character and there is something really wrong.
Detective Chief Inspector Simon Harding was working for the Met at the time as one of their top senior investigating officers in serious crime.
A woman called the police on the 26th of April 2019 to 50 Vendome Close to check on the welfare of a man. She told the police that he was somebody who was ill, that she had been helping, and by that very nature that he was vulnerable and potentially could be ill. And this was his address that he told her. And the reason she'd done that is because she had been giving him money. She was an upstanding Christian woman in the society, and she almost looked at him as kind of as a project for her to help. And having taken almost £1,400 off her, towards the end, as it was when she called the police, she was worried about his health because he kept refusing to meet her. She called the police to say, he's supposed to meet me, he said he's very ill, can you check on his welfare? And that's the first time the police officers arrived at Vendome Close.
This address was situated in an area within the East End borough of Newham.
So Canning Town is quite a typical borough in London, full of diverse groups, lots of different religions all mixing together. It's probably one of the busier boroughs in London in terms of crime, but equally has quite a larger police presence than some of the smaller boroughs in London. It's quite close to some of the biggest financial centres in the world, and equally has its fair share of London estates and slightly more a poor area, if you like. Very diverse in terms of financial stability, should we say.
This seemed like any other missing person inquiry, with the usual sad but unremarkable possible outcomes.
So the police response to the woman's call was to attend the address, and much like a lot of calls in London where somebody is thought to have either collapsed behind locked doors or perhaps passed away, first they looked, banged on the door, no response, checked with neighbours, and having looked through the windows and made as best assessment as they could, and it was at that stage they said, well, let's leave it for 24 hours, whatever, just to see. He wasn't in the high-risk category at that stage.
The man's name was Zahid Yunus.
So when there's no contact after that time, then the officers would go back, and they were sent back, different officers this time, sent back to go and look at the premises, and this time they felt perhaps that they needed to just double-check on his welfare, and the easiest way to get in at that time was through a window at the front.
Hello, police. Police officer, make yourself known.
The flat is in a fairly messy state. It's had a sort of wooden floor down, and there is no one there from what they can see. They go in to search every room, and there is that sudden moment where one of the officers sees a room. It's a little bit like a box room, and the officers moved a lot of stuff away from their door.
There's a freezer here that I want to get into. It's locked.
The officer decided that he wanted to break the freezer open. He got a crowbar from the police van and broke open the freezer. And what we saw next was just incredible. Having lifted up the lid, there is a white sheet and something sticking up. And when he moves the sheet, the first thing he sees is a human foot with a sock on, and the sock has got a Superman logo on. So the officer quickly did what he is trained to do, knew it was a crime scene, called his supervisor, and the place was shut and locked up, waiting for specialist units. I remember exactly where I was, sitting in the office when that phone call came in and said that there's a body been found in a freezer, which is incredibly suspicious. So the murder teams are called straight away to come and assess what might have happened. So one of the things we do is call a crime scene manager.
Initially, the sole focus would have been on this freezer.
Dave Collins has been a crime scene manager working with the Met for over 30 years.
He'd have done his crime scene assessment to look around just to see what else, to give you an idea of what is there. Are there any blood-stained weapons? We'd look to know how the victim has died at this point. So are there any blood-stained weapons, blood? To give you an idea of what may have occurred.
The crime scene manager would go there, make a forensic assessment without anybody else going in, just themselves, perhaps one other with them, and would report back, this is what we have initially, and talked about the flat being messy, there are items lying around. And in fact, was seen that there were items of female property within the flat at that time. So we already started to understand that there was something slightly out of the ordinary. If this guy lived here on his own, there are female handbags lying around. So that was fed back to me quite early on.
It's important for me to get down to that scene to understand what it is about. So when I arrive here, there is cordon tape, there are police officers, uniformed officers guarding the scene and making sure that nobody enters who shouldn't be there. We sign everybody in and out to make sure that we have that continuity. And as people start to arrive, other specialisms, the crime scene manager would be here already, have started their forensic examination, and I would then get briefed by them. They would sit with me and we'd go through, perhaps with my detective sergeant, detective inspector, we'd go through everything that they could tell us about that particular scene. And also, I would be getting information all the time from other officers who are working on the investigation about people they might have spoken to, already knocking on neighbours' doors, people that might know them. And in this particular case, what was really important was, can you put Zahid Yunus with a female? And all those inquiries and research you do around potential people that live there start immediately. Because obviously you have body, but you have no person who might have done it. All those bits of the jigsaw around him and his involvement and link to the flat and everybody else's link to the flat need to be brought together at the same time that your priority is to start identifying who that person is in the freezer.
In the spring of 2019, police in East London searching the flat of a missing man made an altogether more shocking discovery. Locked inside a chest freezer, officers had found a frozen body. But just who was this person, and how had they ended up here?
In 2019, there was quite an increase in murders across London. It was reaching levels where we hadn't seen for quite a long time. So East London, in that quarter of London, was particularly busy, probably the busiest quarter of London at the time. So it wasn't uncommon for there to be a murder in this area.
As Simon and his team began to look for clues in the flat, the forensic investigators had one immediate priority.
That first major thing was to get the freezer out of that flat securely, because there was no electricity. The guy had not topped up his meter, so getting that out was important, because the body is now starting to defrost, or would start to defrost. And so getting it into a forensically secure area where, as it defrosted, we could deal with it in terms of a forensic examination was really important.
But what seemed like an already gruesome case was about to take a whole new turn.
The freezer's taken to the mortuary, and because of the fact that the body was frozen to the sides of the freezer as well, it was not something you could just take out. So it went under a CT scan or an X-ray, and it was then that I had the call to say, there's a second body underneath. You know, you never forget something like that. There's now 2 bodies in that freezer. So it was at that point we realised we really had somebody that was potentially incredibly dangerous. Yes, 1 body's a dangerous person is at loose, but 2, you're now talking about somebody who's on their way to essentially being a serial killer.
Now Simon and his team were in a race against time to find out who that killer was and to identify the victims.
It actually took quite a number of days before any post-mortem could take place, because it wasn't just that the body at the top was frozen to the sides of the freezer, it was also that the 2 bodies themselves and what they were wrapped in were frozen together as well. And the length of time that they'd been frozen meant that the thawing process of those 2 bodies, as horrible as it sounds, took such a long time to happen, days and days before we could even start a post-mortem. So, and that means that we can't necessarily quickly identify who the people are, because you can't get to the bodies because they were wrapped in different things. The body on top of the freezer was wrapped in a white sheet. That itself had frozen solid, and frozen solid around the body. And you could see that there was clothing on the body, in the legs, but you couldn't make any sort of form of facial identification at all at that time. You had to wait for everything to thaw out.
The body that lay on the bottom of the freezer, it was in a fetal position, in a blue sleeping bag, wrapped in plastic. The plastic came from the box that contained the freezer. With the bodies being defrosted and then frozen again, it resulted in both of them being heavily decomposed. Once they were separated, it was very difficult to assess their injuries for this reason and give a cause of death.
So the process was incredibly complex at the time, and people wanted answers as quickly as possible. You know, who were these people? And we have people come forward thinking it might be their daughters or sisters or mums who had been missing for a certain amount of time, and you couldn't give satisfactory answers straight away. So we had to wait to get to that stage where something on those bodies or something in the flat perhaps could give us that identification. So whilst I'm waiting for the bodies to defrost and the items to defrost, my teams are searching the flat in a forensically controlled way as well, under the guidance of the crime scene manager. And the methodical search that goes on there, any items that we find as we search a flat can help to identify who those bodies might be. And there were some finds within the flat that started to bring some names forward, and was a handbag belonging to Mirajan Mustafa.
Mirajan Mustafa, also known to friends and family as Jan, had gone missing some 11 months earlier from her home in the nearby area of Custom House. In May 2018, with no knowledge of where she was, Mirajan's family had started an appeal to find her.
We'd go to local hospitals, we'd go to agencies, we'd go to markets, wherever we thought possible, we would go, print up our own posters and cover that area, just to make sure there was as much awareness as we could. We had a lot of support by the local Newham contact, helping us with newspaper articles, putting Jan's front page. Jan's personality is very bubbly, she's very lively. You know when Jan's in the room. She's got a really big, beautiful smile, and she just lights up the room. She was just really fun and lively, very bubbly person. She always put everyone before herself. She was always like that. She was a very loving and caring person. She loved street dancing. She would hire out halls and teach kids street dancing. She'd do it locally where she used to live all the time. Everyone knew Jan, everywhere. Everywhere you go, everyone knew Jan. Yeah, she was a very popular person.
I've always been close with my sister. Always been close with her. There's nothing she could ever do that'll upset me, you know, because she was, how can I say, she was so loving and caring. She'd always want to make everyone else happy and forget about herself.
Now, at long last, clues as to Mirajan's whereabouts began to surface.
In that handbag was things like medication with her name on the label, other personal items. She had been reported missing by her family, her sister, her cousin, and there was an active missing persons inquiry. But that missing persons inquiry had been going on since May 2018. As we search the flat and we find any names, female especially, we want to get to them as quickly as possible, find out where they are to ensure they're still alive. If there are lots of female items in a flat, which there were in this case with different names, then it's important for us to get to them as quickly as possible. And we did. But the one that stood out was Jan, because she was a missing person and she was still missing to that very day. So that was really at the time I thought, well, it's looking likely that this is Mirajan Mustafa, who is in the freezer.
I was on the train coming back from work, and I was just waiting for the bus. And again, I'm on my phone, going through my messages, and I come up across an article online that said that something had happened in Custom House, where some bodies had been found in a property. Well, as soon as they told us, me and Mel just literally broke down crying in the house, and we was hugging police, like, we don't even know you, but it just felt like the right, you know, you freeze, you don't know what to do, like, it was just, yeah, it was really hard, and like, it was the waiting game that was horrible. It was like waiting to hear, is it her, isn't it her?
So if one of the dead women in the freezer was Mirajan, who was the second? 2019, the bodies of 2 women had been found in a freezer in a flat in Canning Town, East London. The first woman was thought to be Mirishan Mustafa, a 37-year-old who had been reported missing 11 months earlier. Now a painstaking forensic search of the flat would provide clues as to who the second woman was.
One of the items we found inside the flat was a ripped-up diary, ripped-up drawings and letters, and a name appeared on there as Henriette. But there were lots of names of girls around the flat in different ways. So yes, she was one of those names, but didn't stand out as much as anybody else at that particular time. And then one of the officers in my team found that he'd been stopped in August 2016. And I'm thinking, well, that's 3 years, nearly 3 years before this all happened. And that stopped with Henriette Sooks. And one of the ways that we would look at trying to find her would be through the normal systems of benefits or anything else that might be. We couldn't find her anywhere. We did find that that was the last time that she was ever seen or spoken to that we knew as police officers, which wouldn't be unusual. But we thought, well, let's try and see if it is her or isn't her.
Henriette Sooks was from Hungary and was hoping to become a UK resident. Sonia Lynch was manager of a local homeless centre where Henriette was a frequent visitor.
Henriette was really quite bubbly. She was always laughing, smiling, joking. She had a very pretty, beautiful face. She always seemed quite upbeat. She would come into the day centre, good morning. Her situation was she had lost the accommodation that she was in and she had to go to the street. She wasn't working, so she couldn't afford to pay for it. We took a group of clients away. There's quite a few pictures of her sitting, watching, being attentive, and just the look on her face. She took part in all the activities, the team-building activities. That is the most memorable time we have of Henriette, and she was happy, and she took part. And she spoke about what she wanted to do. We were working on getting her passport so she could get a job and get her documents. So she wanted so much more, and she wanted to move forward.
Detectives now believed that they had discovered the identity of the 2 women. To find out just how they'd ended up in the freezer, they needed to track down the flat's tenant, Zahid Yunus.
My team are still trying to find Zahid Yunus, and we have now brought in other units to try and find him as well. And that research around his life, to find out where he might be, whether it be like a job centre, whether it be a relation or a friend, using the intelligence that we have, that people are going to those locations and trying to find him, being a priority. Still in the back of my mind, I've got to think, is he the killer? But he's certainly going to have an answer as to why there is 2 bodies in his freezer. So we did find him, and found him a couple of days later staying at his brother's house. And it was then that he came out of that house trying to get into a taxi that he was intercepted by officers and arrested. It didn't go easily. He put up a little bit of a struggle. There was enough officers there. He's a big man. He's 6'4". He's not thin by any means. He's a big lad, and also he was allegedly boxer. So there is an element of risk and safety around arresting somebody like that. Once he's in custody, you have a little bit of a weight lifted off you. But it's important, again, to think always that, is this the person who acted alone?
While detectives questioned Yunus about the grisly find in the freezer at his home, forensic pathologists were attempting to determine for definite that the bodies were that of Jan and Henriette, who they examined first.
So once post-mortem commenced, it was very difficult to determine her injuries due to the decomposition. She had up to about 50 wounds. Some of them may well have been stab wounds. She looked like she'd also been stamped on, suffered a number of fractures to her ribs.
If this was indeed the body of Henriette Sukes, it would seem that this wasn't the first time she had suffered at the hands of another.
We found that she'd been a victim of a crime some time before. We obtained her DNA sample from being a victim of crime and compared it against the DNA of the second body in the freezer, and they matched. So we knew then that we identified the second body, and that was Henriette Sukes.
The post-mortem examination would also formally identify the second victim as Mirishan.
There were identifying features of Jan that we could use to try and help us with the identification. It was a tattoo on her body that helped us, which was later then supported by DNA from the family against the DNA of Jan.
Pathologists would discover that the injuries found on Mirishan's body were remarkably similar to those found on Henriette's.
This victim had about 20-odd injuries, again consistent with being punched and stamped. She had a broken sternum, hyoid bones and larynx bones.
But some questions regarding the deaths of Mirishan and Henriette could never be answered.
Both bodies were very decomposed because we were told that the electricity had been on and off at the premises.
Without a clear cause of death, clues about the victims' injuries and when they were inflicted formed a vital part of the case for Met investigators.
If somebody's only just died and usually you can see bruising around the neck, which would suggest strangulation, but obviously with such decomposition, no opinion could really be given. Both sets of bones were sent off for osteoarticular examination. Now, the body on the bottom, when she was identified, we believe that 9 months before this incident, she'd been pushed out of a window and suffered some horrific injuries. So we needed to show that that incident wasn't related to her death now. So in this osteoarticular examination, they were able to show that the injuries that she'd received had been 1 to 3 weeks before her death, therefore nothing to do with the incident 9 months prior to this. The bones from the body on the top, again, were sent off osteoarticular exam, and when they came back, it was deemed that her injuries were received within 3 days of her death.
With the flat's sole resident, Zahid Yunus, still in custody, Simon needed to either charge him or let him go.
My conversations with the Crown Prosecution Service involved talking about what we had at the time, and I couldn't say to them how these bodies had been killed. All I could say was there were 2 bodies in a freezer, and that Zahid Yunus was the sole occupant of the flat. There's no way he would not have known that those 2 bodies were in that freezer. His fingerprints were found on the outside of the freezer, so there is a connection with him in that freezer, a connection with him in the flat. Nobody else seems to be involved. Therefore, the Crown Prosecution Service had to make that decision that there was not sufficient grounds at that time to charge him with any murders, but they were able to charge him with preventing a lawful burial, and that allowed us to have him in custody, because he was kept in custody, and allowed us to continue the investigations as quickly as possible to try and get towards that ultimate charge of murder against the 2 bodies.
While post-mortems and DNA analysis were taking place, police were still looking for clues in Zahid Yunus's flat about the events leading up to Henriette and Mirishan's deaths, and possible connections between them and him.
We also have to be aware that there may be other victims. We have 2 in a freezer, but unbeknownst to us, there may be more. We were now tasked to look at fingerprinting the property and an examination for any blood to see if we could base the intelligence for names. So light source examination, which involves using a laser, emitting different wavelengths or spectrums of light to identify finger marks unseen to the naked eye.
And finally, one tiny fragment of forensic evidence to place Mirashan Mustafa, when she was alive, in the kitchen of Zahid Yunus's flat.
Through our fingerprint examination, we found one of her fingerprints on the cooker door.
As the forensics team delved deeper, the tiny flat revealed more secrets.
It had been redecorated recently, painted, and a new floor laid in the lounge. In one of the outbuildings, there are a number of rolled-up carpets. These were sent off to the lab to see if we could identify any blood, hairs, fibres on them. Once they'd finished with them and came back to the property, we were able to lay them out in the rooms that they appeared to have come from. And quite a substantial amount of Henrietta's blood was found on these carpets.
Other findings in the flat began to show investigators something of what the victims went through during their time there.
These things in the flat with Henriette, which turned out to be her property, had been shredded, ripped up completely. And in fact, over the course of many months, officers put the jigsaws back together with bags full of ripped up bits of paper to try and work out what they were about. Did they have any significance? And in fact, they did, because they were stories that Henriette was saying about how much she loved Zahid Yunus, but also how badly he treated her, the beatings, the controlling behaviour.
There was times where we'd hear shouting, we'd hear windows breaking, things going through windows, screaming from girls coming in and out, police breaking his doors down.
The terrible sounds of these beatings were heard by neighbours in the small block of flats in East London, one of whom was Shauna Woolsey.
There was many times that we heard shouting, coming from inside the flat, with windows open so we could clearly hear who was shouting, women screaming. There was a time when he'd shouting outside his window to a girl on the street, or there'd be times where he's outside his door shouting. At one point, he even kicked out a woman and she didn't have no shoes on, and he was at his kitchen window shouting from outside of the whole flat. So everybody could literally hear him screaming and shouting at this young lady.
A lot of people didn't like him. You know, he was a bit of a pain in the local community, always causing problems, arguments out on the street. So people remembered him, which is fine. We know he lived here, but what we really wanted was people to remember him with somebody else. So the community in this area, quite tight-knit. With the people that live here, they remember him as a problem. You know, Zahid Yunus was a loud, arrogant, shouted, argued with people, was a pain to them quite often. So a lot of community members were happy to come forward and talk to us, and those people were able to tell us, yes, I remember him, I know him at the time, and I remember him with certain people. And we had statements, and the community came forward to help us to say, this description is of one of the people, and we were very confident that was Mirashan that they saw Zahid Yunus with at the time when she went missing.
Still in custody, Zahid Yunus continued to refuse to answer any questions as to what had happened in his flat.
The fact he wasn't saying anything, we had to bring in all that circumstantial evidence around him to suggest that he was the only person that would have been in contact with them. All that information that we brought to the CPS, many months later, eventually he was charged with murder. So we knew that first hurdle was achieved, and therefore we're going to trial, and the trial would be all that evidence together, and we'd continue that right the way up to the trial to gather as much as we could about him, the girls, and previous victims. And bringing those previous victims to court was the next major hurdle for us.
Simon and his team now believed that Mirashan and Henriette weren't the only women to have suffered at the hands of Zahid Yunus. Could these other victims now help to bring justice for the families who had lost their girls? Every week, 2 women are killed in the UK as a result of domestic abuse. In 2020, after months of painstaking investigation, the Metropolitan Police's Specialist Crime Unit were trying to bring justice for the families of 2 of them, Henriette Souks and Mirasham Mustafa. Their bodies had been found in a freezer belonging to one man, Zahid Yunus, and now Senior Investigating Officer Simon Harding had enough evidence to charge him with double murder. The victims' bodies showed almost identical injuries to each other, and now more evidence against Yunus would come from ex-partners who'd suffered similar harm at his hands.
There was a pattern of abuse which I saw, which was a number of them had ribs broken, and mainly down the left-hand side as well. So as a right-handed man who considered himself to be a boxer as well, it was kind of a pattern of his abuse that he would punch people in the ribs. Both of Mirasham and Henriette suffered severe broken ribs down that one left-hand side. Henriette had all but 2 ribs broken. Mirasham had 5 ribs broken, plus the sternum was broken as well. So you can see that pattern of his abuse, and he's willing to not just hit women, but really, really inflict serious injuries and pain to women that he was involved with. He would kick them, punch them, stamp on them, slap them, sometimes threaten them with knives. He would do whatever he wanted to. He considers that women are nothing to him. We knew we had somebody who was really, really dangerous, at the top end of the spectrum of dangerousness of a domestic abuser, or even just as a human being, really. Part of his emotional torture and the way that he would start coercing and controlling these women was to literally lock them away. So a number of stories came out where, yes, he would lock them in bedrooms, take away their phones, not allow them to go out, but he would also take away any communications they had with family members, stop them calling, or sit there whilst they were speaking to their family to make sure that nothing was being said that he didn't want. He would lure them in with buying things for them, and if they were vulnerable, a lot of them didn't have a roof over their head, so one of the things he could offer them was somewhere to stay in exchange for whatever he wanted.
How did Mirasham and Henriette become so vulnerable that they were easy prey for Yunus? Mirasham's family had watched it all unfold in front of them.
The reason Jan did spiral out the way she did, Jan was a single mother. At the time, she had 2 children. So she was a really hard-working mother, supporting both her children and trying to work to support them to make sure they had everything they needed. So while Jan was working, she'd received a letter to say that her benefits, rent benefits had stopped. But Jan didn't really understand sometimes when she'd get letters what they meant. And she didn't give it to anyone at the time because she was constantly working, taking the kids to school, juggling a single life as a mother. She got into a lot of arrears to the point Jan got evicted from her property with her children. Jan then moved into Custom House with her mum. She just spiralled out of control. She started losing weight, she wouldn't have money, she'd struggle with shopping, it just went all out of control. She became addicted to drugs, and basically she was then very weak and very vulnerable, and obviously she was preyed on because of her weakness and her vulnerability.
Increasingly, as Mirasham's drug addiction became more severe, she spent less and less time at her mum's. These disappearances became more frequent until one last time when she never came home at all.
And then Mum would ring me, Jan's not come home. And it just went on from there, really. Panic. Yeah. Panic just started from then. Because I'd ring her phone and it'd ring, no answer. And I'd ring it 10, 20, 30 times a day. Then I'd message her until the day her phone gets cut, or I couldn't call her again.
The second victim, Henriette, on the other hand, was already susceptible to abusive relationships when she met Eunice.
That's when he would begin drawing her into his world. Promises of looking after her, treating her well, all the things that had never happened to her. And he knew who he was targeting, once again, that vulnerable person.
Finally, more than a year after Henriette and Mirishan's bodies were found, Zahid Yunus's trial for their murder began in July 2020.
Yes, when he was arrested originally and interviewed by officers, said no comment. So when he gets to court and now he's going to take the box, everybody is sitting up. You don't know what he's going to say. You know, what's he going to say? That bring in somebody else? Is he going to admit it? Obviously not, because he's gone not guilty. Whatever it might be. But one thing you do know is that anything that's going to come out of his mouth pretty much is going to be a lie. He was immediately disrespectful to the judge, who was a female. She put him straight back in his place, but that's his personality. Very, very emotional case. Jury found it very emotional as well, because you're hearing about the worst possible domestic abuse, you know, victims who have suffered such great pain in their lives. Many have never recovered from the emotional impact that Zahid Yunus had on them. We were fairly confident at the time, as we were drawing to the end of the trial and the jury were about to go out, that we had enough. And then we sat back for 5 days and waited. I can't tell you really how hard that is. It's hard for me. How hard is that for a family?
After those 5 days, the jury found Zahid Yunus guilty of the murders of Henriette Souks and Mirishan Mustafa.
When he was sentenced, it was a relief. Yeah, it was a relief. He got what he deserved. But then when I walked out of the court, it was, I was sad. It felt like I'm not going to fight for her anymore. The end. And I wanted to carry on. Because that's the only way I felt she was near me. By looking for her, by fighting for her, by going to court every day. And then what we was fighting for, he got his life sentence. But then it felt like she was gone now.
Yunus was later sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 38 years. But for his victims' loved ones, the gruesome way their lives ended bore no resemblance to the women they'd known.
I miss Jan all the time, but I watch her videos of us always joking and laughing, mucking about. I've got beautiful videos of her with the children when my girls were born, her bathing them and putting them to bed. I've got really beautiful memories of Jan.
When you love something so much, it's like words. There's not a word for it. There's not a word to tell someone how much you love them. It's holding them. And that's all I want to do, is hold her and let her feel that love from me. And just tell her whatever she's done in life, whatever path she chose, I'm still proud of her.
Thank you.